We have a great opening speaker. This is just, I'm just thrilled about this. This fellow was born and raised near St. John's, Newfoundland. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He established himself early on as a quick-witted and accomplished writer, broadcaster, and teacher. He's also got some political experience. He worked as an executive assistant to the leader of the Liberal Party of Newfoundland, and then he ran twice for office in provincial elections, once as a Liberal and once as a Tory, and he lost both times. No, I'm just saying, okay? Anyway, he currently hosts CBC's Cross Canada Checkup. He contributes weekly TV commentaries on diverse topics to The National, and he writes book reviews, commentaries, and a weekly column for The National Post. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Rex Murphy.
I think thank you is the operative word here. I understand that one of the themes of your great conference is, by the way, I better announce it at the very beginning, I have got a cold. I picked it up from the gore weather that we're having. Yeah, I did. I kept my carbon hoof print down last night. I didn't come in by plane. I took the Suzuki Tunnel. I do have a cold, so if you find me hacking more than normal, please ascribe it to the burgeoning glories of global warming, which I've heard from other sources, by the way, are the source of conflict in Syria. And that aligns very well with my high school history, which explained the 100 Years' War as the result of a Chinook. No. I do want to thank you for being here. I understand that the very purpose of my being at the head of the conference is to get the anticlimax out of the way. I normally perform that function in more closed circumstances, but it is a treat to be here. It's necessary. I'm digressing, and I haven't yet begun. How do you leave the path unless you're on it? But we'll get to that later. I do want to thank Chuck for bringing up those elements of my life that obviously will have you screaming in applause, that I applied twice to the courtesies of the Newfoundland people that they would elect me as a representative, and they shunned me as only Newfoundlanders can shun, but he left out part of the glories of that. By the way, it was not a Liberal Tory. That's a slight confusion. He is right that I ran twice. The first time I got involved in politics, it was with the Newfoundland Liberals, and that's true. My name is Rex. I was a Liberal. I only got there because they had some arithmetic problems, and they needed an extra candidate that they'd forgotten. And I was bought. I'm using an active verb here. I was bought with an offer of all the Kentucky Fried Chicken I can eat for a week. I lost that election, as Chuck again has so generously informed you, but only by a small margin. It was about 140 votes, and then when in a fit of delirium, I repeated the process and went once more to the Newfoundland people. The second time they had an opportunity of giving me a full and careful assessment, I was rejected by 7,800 in a district that only had 5,000. And this part is true, and an even greater in glory. I wasn't going to do this. I'm digressing now from the digression. I have to tell you that I represent something unique in Canadian politics, what not to do. There were three of us in the race, and I haven't got time to detail it, but there were three of us, a mayor, a figure skater from Labrador East. That's a real paradox. Up in Labrador East, the only triple axles are on the trucks. And me. And I'm skipping a whole lot of really interesting stuff. At the end of that election campaign, the mayor had won, the figure skater was second, and I came in fourth. And it's very easily explained that in St. John's, they had a very small real estate company, and I know a lot of Newfoundlanders are here, and they'll know it. He didn't do any television advertising, but he had interesting real estate signs, Tony Murray and Associates. On the night of that particular Newfoundland election, it was the mayor, the figure skater. Tony Murray and Associates came in third. I'm the only person here in this room or anywhere else that's lost an election to a real estate sign. This is the quality of mind you have before you. I will leap into it. I made the mistake of writing this speech, so it will not be as interesting as if I had waited and let God dictate whatever it was I'm going to say here this morning. And should I stumble into coherence at any point, I would appreciate that someone would raise their hand so I can recognize the moment as well. It's an interesting gathering to be here. It's an august gathering, but I approach it with some trepidation. I've done the best that I can do to appear and to be somewhat at ease and mindful, of course, of a possible Pat Martin moment. I've paid a visit to Hudson's Bay Underwear before I got here because I really don't want to be displaced from my concentration by any unwanted pressure on my awesome points of order. Now, when we look to Parliament Hill, not many of us think of the Temple of Venus. And if there are any of those who do in this audience, I suggest remedial psychiatry. I have a long memory, though, and I do remember the day that was a very rich moment. Excuse me, I will be coughing. A very rich moment, something like out of Romeo and Juliet, when, as you will recall, John Crosby ululated his famous love overture to Sheila Copps, which was a moment of truly heart-bleeding non-partisanship. Mr. Crosby, you will recall, masqueraded his affection in a wonderful Mexican ballad. Thank God we live in a multicultural country. And he yodeled across the aisle over the mace in front of the speaker, one of the most touching arias of the human voice. It wasn't Pavarotti, I grant you, it wasn't even Roy Orbison. Mr. Crosby in his singing robes is like Elmer Fudd with laryngitis. But the words still ring out. Pass me the tequila, Sheila, and lie down and love me again. You know, it was for moments like that that the great cathedral of Canadian democracy that we call the Parliament building was made. Even more, that same day, another true House of Commons giant, and I'm referring, and I mean this, he was a giant, the late Honorable Herb Gray, whom many remember as the Mel Torme of standing orders, and the velvet fog at the headquarters of the Rideau itself. He then, after Mr. Crosby, held the House spellbound with a reading of the 13 amendments to the Navigable Waters Act, with sub-amendments sung a cappella by a choir of clearly terrified parliamentary pages. Who says our democracy doesn't have its high points? This was at the very moment that Mr. Clinton was spinning out the meaning of the word is. So when it comes to competitions of that kind, I think we're well ahead. I'm going to skip a lot now because I just read it over again and it doesn't seem as interesting as it did last night. There's a certain amount of candor going on here. I want, if I can, to drift even momentarily into some seriousness. It's obviously brought about by simple location. We know where we are. The Great War Memorial is outside. The Parliament buildings are just a little way up. And there's no one in this room who cannot recall with some intensity, both of sorrow and of pride, the events that took place just bare months ago. The events that involved a young, brave, and handsome soldier and a man of active service, longer in years, but of immense courage and duty. And I remember from my slot over in Toronto in the news, I'll just offer as an aside, I don't really consider myself a journalist. I bear the same relationship to journalism as a streetwalker does to the Department of Highways. If you hear those clicking heels, they're mine. But we will remember that that was a day that none would welcome, and it was a day that none will forget. It was a day in which we saw, and everybody recognized, a matchless fusion in both parties, one tragic, one ennobling, both deeply patriotic, a matchless fusion of duty, bravery, and selflessness. And what I want to bring up now is not the particular moments of the actual day, but the response that it summoned from the entire Canadian nation. We get very few moments of this kind when we get so overwhelming, so consistent, and so unqualified, meaning unqualified by any hesitation or any demarcation of what we understood instinctively and at all levels of society, in all directions of the map, in all corners, all ethnic, everything, that this was a national Canadian moment. And the combination of pride and grief, because they were intermixed to a degree that they will never be separated, constituted a reminder, at least in my particular case, to how much it is that in this country that has so much and that is so advanced, that there is a core sentiment of regard for the Canadian way, in which, due to our national character, our natural inhibition about self-display, waits for those extraordinary moments, either of triumph or of tragedy, in which they do find their release. And it was the power of that response. I know the events that triggered it were truly savage, in the case of the young corporal. And I know that the symbolism vastly enhanced even those events. It was the war memorial. It was the tomb of the unknown soldier. And here we had in the form and face, in the very bloom of his days, of Corporal Cirillo, it was almost a sweet irony that he placed his face, his form, onto the otherwise unknown face of the unknown soldier. And in Kevin Vickers, and all praise was worthy, we saw a gentleman, a category we seem to see less and less of the old school, housed in all the so-called antique virtues of character, of duty, not asserting his presence as an ego, but as a servant. And the combination of all of those factors, even if they were not articulated, the combination of all those factors swelled forth into one unanimous chorus that hit the nerves, the minds, and the hearts of all Canadians. And there you had it. This is a moment of the nation. And this is a moment that registers on the national consciousness. This is not a group moment. It's not a provincial moment. It's not some special interest moment. It's not a parliamentary tactic moment. It's a moment above all other considerations except our common fealty to each other and the idea that what happens to any one of us as individuals, not as members of groups, as individuals, matters to all of us as Canadians. And we have had those sentiments, and we have had them before. I'm going to mention another name that comes into the same theme. Forgive me, I ask for darker stuff, but they're timid here. I remember on the occasion of the passing of Peter Lougheed, and it was understood, very much understood, that Peter Lougheed was one of those great emblems of the Canadian Confederation. I think instinctively of Peter Lougheed when I do think of this idea of Canada that I've already adverted to in the particular intense and universal response to the actions in Ottawa some months ago. Peter Lougheed gave us an example, a high example of Canadian being. His love for Alberta, to use a cliche, was part of his DNA. And I don't need to tell portions of this room that if you could distill the idea of Alberta and distill the idea of an Alberta way and choose for it a form and a face. Both the form and the face would very obligingly be that of the late Mr. Lougheed. Yet Mr. Lougheed's embodiment of his province and his profound fealty to it posed no challenge or contradiction to a much stronger emotion. He was, and it was in his own words. It's not a deduction from us looking from the outward. It was in his own unforgettable words that he was more a Canadian and a larger Canadian than he was even an Albertan. His patriotism was a patriotism all the more intense and charged because it was irradiated by the foundational love for his province. And that's the other great dynamic of Canadian patriotism. There's no one more dementedly attached to the point of delirium and possibly even sickness to their place of origin than Newfoundlanders. We're absurd. We like it. I mean, we've had 500 years. When I think of climate change, I often think of Newfoundland. We've been waiting for it to stop change. I haven't seen 2 days in a row for all my years. There's nothing more impenetrable to reason than the bottomless affection of Newfoundland for Newfoundlanders for Newfoundland. But that's all the more powerful because it is the radium, it is the light that springs and gives stronger luminosity to the larger attachment of country. Now, of all the examples, Mr. Lougheed's white-hot affiliation with his home province and the value that he saw in it, he knew that incorporation within the Confederation animated that patriotism even more greatly. I'm going to take a little bit of a nerve here. I'm going to introduce yet a third figure, and I will ask you to hold your applause. Pierre Elliott Trudeau. Restrain yourselves. You can save the standing ovation for later, please. But I'm bringing him up for a reason, because he provides a perfect, parallel, and contrastive example. Mr. Lougheed's understanding of the dynamic of Canadian patriotism, that it begins in the local, but is transcended and lit by it, the national supervening, was exactly the message that in his strongest politics, and on this you will agree, when he spoke to his own, if I can put it that way, when he spoke to Quebecers, and by extension to the rest of the country, he said to Quebecers, if you want to be the proudest Quebecers that you can be, if you want to be most fulfilled as Quebecers, if you want to expand the range both of your individual and your collective talent, if you want to achieve the summit of what it is to be a Quebec citizen, the stage on which you must operate is the Confederation. Because everything becomes larger. The arena in which you play, the energies that you let loose, your attachment to roots other than your own that then reinforce what you already have. It is very interesting that Pierre Trudeau, in his particular way and in a more dramatic context, in a competition with separatists on the very grounds of a localized patriotism, pointed to the higher patriotism, the stronger one, and the one that makes more appeal to the larger idea of the human spirit. So I find it neat. I find it a lovely instance of serendipity that the two most emblematic men of our recent political times, Mr. Trudeau, Mr. Lougheed, they converge on this point from seeming opposites of Alberta one place, Quebec another, two worlds, two cultures. They meet on the idea of the superior energies, the superior ideals of being Canadian. One was the incarnation of mature conservatism, and the other was the very face of mid-century liberalism. My main point here, if I have one, is that their full engagement, these emblematic public figures, their full engagement, their complete assertion of country, its primacy, and they were both intensely, in the sense that I'm using it, they were both intensely, simultaneously regional figures. Which brings me to the second point. I'm drinking again. And this is really what I want to make the center. I've spoken of the day that reminded us of how deep the patriotic impulse goes. I've given two, I can give 20 by the way, I can give 50. Given two examples when the national spirit was summoned and inhabited by the personalities of two outstanding people. But now I come to the second point, and I realize that your concerns are more particular, but I do want to operate on one general level. It brings me to this second thought, which is the thought. I've been using the word deliberately, this patriotism word, which in many venues is a word that some people are shy of. That we should more easily let flow than we have been doing a rightful pride and confidence in our common enterprise or our common enterprises. The achievements of Canada are manifest, and I do not need to catalog them. And so why did I summon those names, and why did I put the centrality of the Canadian idea through the examples of them? Well, I think a country must have a center. I think it must have shared and common focus. Diversity, unless it is subsumed under a prevailing idea of a nation, can be nothing more than the shell of a word. It's a word that makes a pleasant sound. It is so vaguely right thinking that it is easily summoned and more easily preached. However much we praise diversity, and I think, by the way, it has its virtues. Many times, however, it is little more than a way of saying, well, being different is good. And that's either a tautology or a self-contradiction. Sometimes it is good, and sometimes it isn't. But preceding diversity, preceding every pocket of identity, region, hometown, ethnicity, pastime, association with cause, genealogy, newly arrived, old arrived, preceding all of that, there should be maintain the banner of our commonality. In our politics in this country, we see more and more of the search for particulars, an ever-widening of specialized interest groups, the assertiveness of ethnic, social, sexual, ideological, and regional subsets. We subdivide and we subdivide, but we rarely, and certainly not with full throat, give thought or sustenance to the ideas, to the enterprises, to the endeavors that are molding and have molded us into common Canadians, pure and simple. Personally, I like the idea of Canada pure and simple. It puts a focus on the individual as a citizen and offers the only substantial grounds of real equality. It takes away the ever-trembling balance beam that plays group against group, subset against subset, or instigates rivalries between ever-mushrooming victim narratives, and instead places the focus on the idea that our first and largest claim, north and south, east and west, is as citizens in common. It is a fact. My fear in this thing, not fear, but my absolute observation is that if you look at Canada, if you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, the confidence that should attend the success that we have already achieved, the deep belief in the common goals that have been reached, the array of successes that have been totaled up are not matched by any overt appreciation and statement of just how well we've done. The withdrawal of confidence from the common endeavor and the reluctance to give it that primacy in our public speech, and in our own thinking, derogates from the very dynamic of the country. Our political systems, whatever their many and deep flaws, and there are many and they are deep, are infinitely superior to those of the closed regimes, the kleptocracies, the theocracies, and the outright dictatorships that cover the world like a disease. Well, where is the air of certitude and conviction that we saw so recently in recent times? Where is that great common pulse of automatic pride that showed up that day in Ottawa? Go back in history when Churchill spoke of valor and honor and bravery and tradition and linked them inexorably to the long and turbulent history of his own country. This was a man speaking with the ultimate confidence and the ultimate conviction of the worth of what the English people had done. He was not erasing their faults, but he was not allowing that captiousness of mind to completely muffle and suffocate the great achievements. And it was the memory of what was right, of what was advanced, of the moves of a great civilization that gave his particular voice the strength and conviction that was necessary. We cannot be timid in expressing our own fealty to the enterprises that we have built. The West has, to its credit, hit major summits in art, in literature, in music, in science, in technology, in education, in social development, in political institutions. There is no arena in which the West, in its main thrust, does not tend towards the better. And if you go into the histories of the sciences and technologies, we are living in an age of miracles that we no longer see as miracles. 2 generations ago, a Canadian from any part of our country, looking at this particular moment, would have to persuade himself or herself that he was in a delirium, that such advances over so short a time could not have been made, could not have been done. And we live in a society that we have composed. We have built the codes of the middle way, the codes of easy dealing with each other. The idea that every member of Canada is a neighbor to every other citizen of Canada. We have built social policies centered on the idea of citizen altruism. We have a temperate nature. We are not racked by civil wars. We do not have the bloodshed, the horror, or the want of 5/8, 6/8 of the rest of the world. And yet, in the face of all that achievement and our acceleration to the very front line of an advanced civilization, you hear Canadians talking about themselves, their heads are down. And there is this understated and often self-regarding inhibition about understanding we got there as Canadians, and that the Canadian idea is the primal one. It is the one before all else. There's one other theme that keeps us from that, and I'll wrap up. We hear of political correctness mainly as a joke. And in many cases, it is a joke. I don't know, and I'll briefly, yet again, digress. This is number 9, I think. You've heard of the vagina monologues. I certainly hope you haven't heard them. I'm very wary of speeches that begin below the belt myself. Shakespeare gave Hamlet 5 soliloquies, but none to his underwear, but that's another point. But you do hear that down in Hollyhock University, there was another person who wanted to participate, himself or herself, in the monologues. And it caused quite a stir because persons who claimed that their equipment was supplied by Mother Nature felt they had a primacy of those who may have had them borrowed or surgically attached. The vaginally impoverished person was ruled incapable of participating in the vagina-rich environment. You think I'm joking? I'm reading the news. That's the joke. And they had a big meeting about it, and is this offensive, or is it not offensive, uncomfortable, you know all those words. And so you have this farcical, and it is, by the way, it's untethered from all human reason, and therefore could only take place on a university campus. But political correctness is not just a joke. Political correctness has moved itself into all sorts of ways. It's more of a fog. It is an inhibitor of our speech. It sets up automatic self-censoriousness. The idea of patriotism, that's an easy one. Is it really acceptable to talk like that? Anything that, like I just said, that ludicrous example, well, maybe someone will be offended on that. We avoid big issues like abortion. We avoid big issues like oil. We mute our comments on what is obviously and ostensibly, in many cases, just plainly insane, because we've got this, somehow or other, we've bought into the atmospherics that our speech must be careful. And in some way, we got to do some weird dance of euphemism, jargon, and argot known only to the most demented sociologists before we can even say good morning. And if you're in Newfoundland and say good morning, you'll probably get hit. But it is true. Well, we've got to break out of that. The idea that in a great democracy, in an educated world, an affluent world, that we ourselves, on the things that we actually believe in, on the things that are at the center of what we are, on enterprises that really count to us, or on issues that are really deep, that for some almost intangible reason, we muffle our appreciation, or we speak in code, or we wait till the room is clear and have a real conversation. This is not the operation of full citizens. I know this is true even on this ludicrous global warming. Mr. Gore can sell a television station he bought for $12 million for $500 million to Qatar, the greatest oil-producing enterprise in the entire Middle East, and it's not going to be talked about too much. Or the idea that you would praise the history of this continent. Oh, we shouldn't do that. Or if you ever get lost in some jungle of campus speech codes. I mean, think of it. The universities, by the way, are truly the worst offenders in the way that they are mutilating the basic concept of a university. It is a place for the search of ideas, the analysis of ideas. And surely, God, we didn't go to war so we could have a long discussion on the vagina monologues. If we did, we should have lost. Well, I have to rush this part of it. The inhibitions not only degrade public discussion, they give a signal of cowardice or lack of faith in the things that we have achieved and the worth of the country itself. The enterprise of the Alberta oil sands, not only in this room I would assume is more or less online with that, but I've gone many, many times and said a number of things. For example, here's a politically incorrect statement par excellence. I think oil is good. I think great projects are great for the national economy. I like jobs. They are always better than no jobs. UI is not as good as a job. Welfare is not as good as a job. I like Newfoundland being a have province. I do not like it being a have-not province. I like offshore rigs. I like Saskatchewan. I like the deployment of great, impressive technologies manned by the most advanced science and technology that we have. I admire work. I think Alberta is a good place. I like I like the mix of citizens of every province and territories working on a grand concept, properly appreciated, a common endeavor that summons tens and even hundreds of thousands of citizens from all the sweep of this country. It's not a threat. It's a national enterprise. It's the damn railway in the 21st century. But if the railway were being built now, dear God, Sierra Club would be tying old women on the tracks. And let me turn the coin over. If the price of oil, as it has, declines and stays declining, I talked to two of my friends, and I mean it. This is not a fiction for the moment. Thursday last, they've been working the last 10 years outside the country, but they started in Alberta. Some of them in Africa, one in Mexico. They've had good jobs. They've been off welfare. They've been keeping their families in supply. Both of them now have no jobs after becoming used to them, but traveling the world is not an easy thing. I don't know how many more because I haven't checked it. But are we going to see tears from the environmental movement? Are we going to see some jobs given up from Greenpeace and Suzuki so that the oil workers that they, for the last 20 years, have been opposing, get some comp? Why is it that you can campaign so furiously for a negative result and wear a badge of virtue, and if you say something positive about a national enterprise, well, it's not correct. This is idiocy of the purest kind. I'm going to sum it up now. I use the oil one because it's a big one, but I use it mainly as a parable to underline what I think I have been saying from the very beginning. We had the episode in Ottawa that show how deep the urge is to finally find some moment in which we can express without inhibition the depth of our passion and appreciation for the country. We have had two outstanding, by any measure of any state, human beings, Pierre Trudeau, Peter Lougheed, who in their varying and even oppositional ways manifested one element of the true national character without reserve, that you are larger and better as an individual and as a citizen of a province or of a group or of a sexual orientation or of anything, because first, you are Canadian. Thirdly, I have said that this disease, self-inflicted, of muting our conversations, of holding back clear expression of those things we support or oppose, and doing this ludicrous dance of euphemism and evasion that we know as politically correctness, dulls the national enterprise. These are things, the first thing the conference of this kind that is speaking of the turn of the next election should be concerned about is the grand idea of the country itself. Now, I'm stealing 90 more seconds, even if you take out the bazooka, Mr. Strahl, because I have one more little tiny story that I think will at least compensate for the tedium I've just put you through. And it's about Newfoundland, and please be patient. It's the only one I have. I've told it 100 times, and I vary it a little tiny bit every time, just to get away with it. It went back to 1997 when we celebrated our 500th anniversary of John Cabot leaving Bristol, England, searching for Beijing, China. He found Bonavista, and this was regarded, back home at least, as a triumph. But even in 1497, it's difficult to mistake Peking, as it then was, I believe, with Bonavista. I can tell you from personal experience, and I know this, that it wasn't until 1982 that Bonavista even had a Chinese restaurant. It's true. And I ain't going to skip a lot. We invited the Queen over. I am skipping a lot because I know the time is there. And she said yes. This is true, by the way. It was on television, so it has to be true. She came over, and it was a disaster. There was rain, there was fog, there was sleet, there was snow, there were winds, there were more snow, there were ice. You couldn't see her. I was down with a camera crew along with 100 other camera crews. I went down for the event. You just couldn't see her. The fog, the rain, the snow, the sleet. It was June the 24th. What were they dreaming of? But we're smart people. So I'm going to again collapse it. They made up plan B. They said, we'll bring her into St. John's. We'll put her indoors. And we'll do it all again tomorrow. But it'll be indoors. Doesn't matter. We'll light it up. Everyone will see her. And we'll pick a place that every Newfoundlander knows is very important to us, part of our culture. And it was a biscuit factory. We sometimes think we have a rich history. I sometimes doubt it. It was a biscuit factory. And every Newfoundlander, you know, you're here. I know you're here because you're everywhere. Purity Biscuits. That's better known than Tim Hortons by a factor of 100. Purity Biscuits is the brand. So they bring her there so Newfoundlanders will know she's connected. And that's all they do. She comes in on a dais, something like this. And there's a guy on the dais. And in front, there's 3 steel vats, huge, 3,000 pounds of warm biscuit dough in each one of them, and great big steel blenders being manipulated by a guy in a white coat on the stage with her, stirring the 9 tons of biscuit dough. And she's got that purse, so she's on a lean. She's going across the stage like this, and she finally gets to him, and I can't do the accent. I wish I could, but I can't. But anyway, she's already looking up. She looks up at him, and she said, now remember where she is. I went to some trouble to tell you. She says then, what are you making, sir? And there was a pause, as long as the Reformation. And Buddy finally said, $13.50 an hour, ma'am. In a single minute, here's the message. I know it's genetically a Canadian not to praise Canada. This can be carried far, far, far too far. Some idea of our common enterprise should be the beginning point of politics, not the end. Our addiction to interest politics, divided politics, partial politics, cause politics, even partisan politics, they all have a bit of their place. But they should not have the supremacy, nor should they have the duration of the discussion that's there. Thirdly, an emphatic and occasionally expressed pride in the idea of the nation of which you are an element is the key resource to keeping it going. Finally, all the comforts that are enjoyed by the people in this room, all the advances that you know, all the ease of communication, all the ease of association, all the ability to talk, all the ability to have the schools, all of these things are partially the construction, the effort of generations before you. This has been a continuous enterprise. Canada has not happened, it has been built. And you, at this point, are the inheritors. And it is your task, A, to appreciate what you have received, to energize it even more, and to the limits of your abilities, to enhance it for the enjoyment of future generations. You're a very patient crowd. Thank you very much. Yay me.